It's Tuesday, October 11th, 2022. My name is Ashton Ellett, here today in Salisbury, Connecticut for an oral history documentary interview with Dr. Loch K. Johnson. Dr. Johnson is the Regents Professor Emeritus of Public and International Affairs at the University of Georgia, where he's also a Josiah Meigs Distinguished Teaching Professor. Born in Auckland, New Zealand, he earned his bachelor's degree in political science from the University of California, Davis, and his PhD in political science from the University of California, Riverside. A renowned scholar of national security policy and in the intelligence community with more than 30 books and 200 articles and chapters to his name, Professor Johnson began his teaching career with stints at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, California State University, San Francisco, Ohio University, and finally the University of Georgia, where he joined the faculty in 1979 and retired in 2019. In addition to a scholarly career, Dr. Johnson has enjoyed a career in government service that included positions as Special Assistant to the Church Committee, Special Assistant to the Ranking Minority Member of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, and Senior Staffer on the Subcommittee on Trade and International Economic Policy, and Staff Director of the House Subcommittee on Oversight Intelligence. He advised the presidential campaigns of Senator Frank Church and Governor Jimmy Carter in 1976, and served on the Aspen Brown Commission from 1995 to 1996. Our previous conversation covering Professor Johnson's career in government service is available online. Today we'll discuss his lengthy academic career and time at the University of Georgia and in Athens. Loch, thank you so much for having us back.
Well, thank you for coming back.
It's a beautiful fall day, as stereotypical and quintessential as you can get here in Northwest Connecticut. I wonder if we can begin. We spent a lot of time a few months ago talking about your work in Washington, and there's going to be some overlap because you stepped away from your work at the University of Georgia to enter government service here and there in various capacities. But I wonder if we could begin, walk us through your thought process of deciding to step away from a full-time career in Washington and return to academia. That's what you wanted to do for those 40 years, those 4 decades left in your professional career.
Yeah. Well, Ash, when I look back over this record that you mentioned, I remember that some people had a profound influence on me. I went to high school in Germany, for example, and I had a teacher there who was just fabulous. He was a historian like you, and he made past events come alive. And so right at the beginning of my formative stage, I had a devotion to good teaching and an interest in history. And then in college, I had another great professor. I was lucky in having some good ones along the way. And I became his research assistant as an undergraduate and really began to see what the life of a professor was like. And I really loved it, loved the concept of it. I like the idea of the search for truth, which is what professors, at least the best ones I think, are dedicating their lives to. I like the idea of the flexible hours. You want to teach 8 in the morning? Go for it. You want to teach in the afternoon? So there's a lot of flexibility in academic life. And then in grad school, I had yet a third professor who very much impressed me. So that all cemented my desire to become somewhat like them, if I could, to become a professor. So I was determined to enter that career pathway. And I got my doctorate and I began looking around for jobs, and instead I ended up getting a fellowship and going to Washington for a year.
Right.
And that whet my appetite for practical politics too. So I was balancing these two interests. And I stayed in Washington just for that fellowship year, but then went to the University of North Carolina and a couple of other places in a visiting capacity, really an excuse to see the South for the first time at Chapel Hill. And then my parents were ailing out in California, so I used a visiting year out at San Francisco. And then I decided maybe I ought to get a real job, a permanent job, and one popped up that was quite appealing at Ohio University.
Right.
So later on, I was asked to come back to Washington in 1975, and I did so, and once again got caught up in practical politics and realized how fascinating that could be. So as you can see, I was really torn,
Yeah.
like a donkey between two bales of hay, I suppose you could say. And I wasn't sure which way I was really going to go. But after a few years on Capitol Hill, I began to realize that it's a very wearing occupation. I was spending long, long days there. Sometimes the American public doesn't give enough credit to public servants in Washington, 98% of whom are very dedicated and put in long hours. And I was willing to put up with that because the work was interesting. I was in the national security domain on Capitol Hill. But then my wife and I had a child, and I thought, ooh, I'm never going to see this little girl. And so I began to think maybe an academic life would have the advantage of the flexibility and being a better dad, for one thing.
Sure.
Plus, I was interested in doing some of my own research instead of research for members of the Senate or the House. So eventually I bailed out of Washington, at least temporarily, and looked around for a job, and lo and behold, in my job interview, I was swept away by Athens, Georgia. And even more importantly, the faculty that I met, who were so warm and gracious, and they indicated a lot of flexibility in terms of supporting my research. And I met a number of students who seemed very friendly. Well, you know how the South is. It's just a really friendly, welcoming place in my experience. And so my wife and I thought, hey, this would be a great place to really jumpstart our academic career again. So that's why I moved down there, because of an interest in being a professor, because of a new child that I wanted to spend more time with, basically.
Now, was there any chance that you would have returned to Ohio University, or had that position been foreclosed?
I could have gone back there.
You could have.
I was tenured there, and I was on leave for a few years. But, you know, I just found that as much as I like the people in Athens, Ohio, I seem to have this affinity for. I should have moved to Athens, New York, when I came up here. But I liked the people there, but it was so remote. It took about 2 hours, it seemed, to get to Columbus. And so I was really not that interested in going back there. It was a hard decision because I've remained in touch with some of the professors there. John Gaddis, you know, as a historian, and others were very fast friends of mine. But we decided we wanted a mightier university to be at. And I went to University of Georgia, and I'd never seen such a beautiful campus in my life. And one thing I picked up on during my job interview, which was, I guess, in 1978, was that this place was on the march forward.
Okay.
It was no longer a sleepy teacher's college. And President Davidson at the time should get a lot of credit for his vision of what the university could be in the future. So I wanted to be part of that effort to build the University of Georgia. And Ash, if you look back to 1979 and what it is now, it's really quite remarkable. It has blossomed into, as you well know, one of the best public universities in the country.
That blossoming just so happened to coincide with your 4 decades there. So I don't know if this is correlation or causation.
No, that was entirely incidental, coincidental.
So at Ohio, you had taught American politics, party politics,
yes,
which you had been trained at in UCal Riverside. But that's not what you were hired to teach at the university, or were you hired to teach, and you sort of developed into this scholar of the intelligence community and the national security apparatus. How did that work?
Well, you know, as an undergraduate, I was initially a zoologist, what today we would call a biologist. The name has changed, I guess. And but I always had a deep interest in politics, I think in part because of John Kennedy. He was such an inspiring figure at the time when I was an undergraduate. So I took an equal number of science and political science courses, and eventually political science won out. I found it a little more interesting to study American politics and international affairs than it was to dissect fetal pigs, which I was doing in the zoology area. So I went in the political science direction, and basically you're right. I was focused mainly on American politics, largely because the faculty that I was drawn to, they were the best faculty at the time, were in that area. Harlan Hahn was, when I went to grad school, my dissertation advisor. And he had been the last student of V.O. Key
That's right.
at Harvard University, who was a mighty figure in the...
Vladimir Orlando Key.
Wow, you may be the only historian who knows a political science name like that. Yes, Vladimir Orlando was a famous figure and wrote detailed histories and studies of American politics. I did my dissertation on national nominating conventions, so I was deeply embedded in American politics. But then suddenly, as I mentioned earlier, I won this scholarship to go to Washington and ended up working with a guy who is primarily a foreign policy person, Frank Church of Idaho. And as I mentioned, even as an undergraduate and graduate school, I continued to take courses in international relations because I was interested in them. And by the way, you can't easily separate American domestic politics from foreign policy. They're really tightly intermeshed.
That was one of my comprehensive exam questions in Professor Jim Cobb's U.S. history exam. So
the great Jim Cobb.
Oh yeah, the man, the myth, the legend.
So I was really combining an interest in both, but the more I spent time on Capitol Hill with Frank Church, the more I began to believe that that was a fascinating domain. And he was particularly interested in the threat of an imperial presidency. Arthur S. Schlesinger Jr., another historian you know well, had written The Imperial Presidency during that period, and we all devoured it. And Frank Church thought he was right on target, and I did, a lot of people did, not everyone. Some people like the idea of an imperial presidency, and Donald Trump would be one example of that, I guess. But we viewed it as a danger to democracy, and that's exactly the great genius of the American Constitution, to understand that threat and to build in safeguards against the president becoming too powerful. So I began to write on that topic. But when I was looking for a job and found one at the University of Georgia, they were basically looking for someone to teach American politics.
Yeah.
And that was one of my areas, and my dissertation was in that area. So I went down there, but knowing full well that I was also going to, once I got settled, going to do my best to begin to teach some courses on international affairs as well. So I combined those two interests. And, you know, Chuck Bullock, who's a distinguished professor at UGA who studies Southern politics, and I wrote a book on runoff primaries together. So I maintained that interest in domestic politics. But more and more I began to be interested in international affairs, and in particular, given my experience with Frank Church, who led an investigation into the CIA, into the activities of the CIA and how that agency had become something of a danger to democracy by spying on American citizens, and what we could do to make sure we had a robust CIA, because there are dangers in the world that we need to protect ourselves against and know about, how to have that organization, but to make sure it no longer spied on American citizens. That became my chief research and teaching area.
So you mentioned international affairs as your interest, but this was there was no international affairs department. This was simply the Department of Political Science. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
Okay.
Yes, in fact, I think we had about 24 members of the political science department, and I believe 3 of them were looking at international affairs. I was not one of them, because I was in the American domain. But I had a lot of overlap with them. And by the way, later on, when I helped lead the founding of the School of Public and International Affairs, I vowed that there would be a Department of International Affairs, because it's so important and needed to stand alone and offer a whole range of courses to students. So I'm sure we'll talk about this later, but the school ended up having that department.
So your first book was A Season of Inquiry, is that right?
Yes.
So that was that about your time on the church committee, or was that your scholarly treatment of the church committee itself? Or a little of both?
A little bit of both, but you know, I had been trained as a political scientist, and you have your doctorate and you know the drill that you go through, you learn the methodology and all of that. So I had learned the importance of being a participant observer, which is political science slang for being a scholar who's inside the government and watching what's going on and keeping notes and learning that way. So as the church committee unfolded, and remember that lasted from 1975 to 76, and was focused on investigating America's, at the time, 12 intelligence agencies, because they had gotten off the tracks and done some things they shouldn't have done. As that unfolded, and I was Frank Church's top aide, I spent a little time every evening keeping kind of diary entries of what happened that day. So later on, in fact, even at that point, I thought, well, maybe one day I can write about that. Later on, I did write about it, and I had these voluminous notes on a daily basis. And not only that, I had played an active role on the research staff of that committee. It's not only Church's Aid, but I was part of the staff, and I had interviewed intelligence people at the very highest levels and gotten to know some of them pretty well. So I knew later, if I left government and decided to write, that would be my first book, The Church Committee Experience. And I had all those notes, and I followed them up as I went to the University of Georgia by flying up to Washington, D.C. occasionally and having further interviews with people that I'd met during the Church Committee. And you know, had I been a political scientist at the University of Southern Illinois or someplace, without any contacts in Washington, do you think I ever would have gotten to the door of these important people in the intelligence domain? Of course not. But I developed some rapport with them, and they were willing to open the door.
Right.
And I mean, I talked to, I think it was 8 directors of CIA. No one else had ever talked to that many in depth. And they were happy to sit down and tell me their points of view. So I was lucky to have that participant observer opportunity. And I cashed in on it later on when I returned to academia and needed to do some writing and wanted to do some writing.
I have a potentially silly process question. You talked about contemporaneous notes and a diary. Did that include the top secret information that you had dealt with, or
no?
How did that work? Did you have to create some sort of firewall between what you yourself recorded,
yes,
and what?
Well, I think that's
your
a
work
very, very good question, and particularly since we've had a former president, Donald Trump, who's taken top secret documents away from the White House to his private residency, which is so prohibited by law and a violation of basic secrecy in the U.S. government. No, I was very much aware of that at the time, and of course all staff members had undergone an FBI investigation to make sure that we were trustworthy, and we'd been told time and time again, look, these secrets are important, they've got to be kept. And so I took that very seriously, as did everyone else. Now, there was one poor staff person who was at a restaurant at the early days of the Church Committee investigation, and he happened to mention to his girlfriend as they were sitting in a booth in the Hawk and Dove restaurant on Capitol Hill,
been there,
a couple of things about what we were doing. Now, they weren't particularly sensitive. They weren't like satellite photography or something. but we were all told not to talk at all publicly about that. And guess who was sitting in the booth next to him? A couple of FBI agents, coincidentally or maybe purposefully, I don't know. But he was fired the next day because the FBI came back and said, hey, you've got an untrusted report. So we all took that very seriously. And I made very careful in my own mind that all the notes I kept, these diary entries, had no classified information. It's not hard to tell the difference between the two as well. But as a safeguard, and this is very important, I think, we signed a secrecy oath. And that required, if we were going to do any writing about the Church Committee later on, we would submit our manuscript both to the U.S. Senate and to the intelligence community, which I dutifully did. And the Senate found nothing at all untoward. The CIA sent me back 4 pages, single space, of what they thought might be sensitive matters that shouldn't be discussed. And I looked at them all, and I went through the list, and I showed them how all of that stuff was already in the public record. Either press conferences by presidents or other people. So they finally let me go forward. But I think that was a useful precaution.
Yeah. So submitting it to the Senate, I assume the Senate Intelligence Committee, did committee staff go through it?
Yes, the new permanent committee staff, because that was a temporary investigative committee. And Frank Church was still there, and he read it, and some other people read it, and they knew that there was nothing classified in there. I mean, I took that very seriously.
Now, do you still have your diaries and everything from that? Or is that at the Russell Library?
Yeah, I do, somewhere, probably in the basement.
Well, I trusted it. One day it'd be at the Russell Library down in Athens.
Well, actually, come to think of it, it may well be already. It was probably in my files that I turned over to the library.
We'll have someone look into that. So Here's a question, more of a fun question, I suppose. What was your favorite? You know, you've written or edited 30 or so books. Which one was your favorite to research and write over that time?
I must say, and this is disappointing to me in some respects, the very first book, which makes me wonder about all those other books I wrote. But the first one was maybe like your first baby. It's a kind of a precious thing for you. And it was based on the 16 months of personal observation.
Right.
Then another 6 or 7 years of writing it up, based on these diary notes and all the interviews I mentioned. So it was a huge commitment to me. And by the way, I probably made a huge mistake because I sent it off to Simon & Schuster, a very distinguished publishing house, and they wrote me back and they said, "We love this, but you have to cut it by 50%.
Ooh.
And I told them, "I'm not going to cut that by 50%. Well, that was probably short-sighted because if I'd gone with Simon & Schuster, it would have gotten a lot of publicity and probably a lot of sales. Instead, I went with a university press that focused on national security, University of Kentucky Press, and they did a fabulous job, and they kept everything I wanted. So I had the advantage of getting the book I really wanted, but with a press that didn't have much visibility. But I don't care. I don't care about that. I like the book the way it came out, and that's my favorite book.
You did well for yourself afterwards.
I think so, yeah. And why do we write these things anyway? We write them, at least I do, for my own enjoyment, for my own edification. And if others like it and learn from it, then great. But that's not my major focus.
I think that's a great perspective on academic writing. So, but there's actually Season of Inquiry Revisited, which
Yes.
tell me about that.
Well, that's a story of the University of Kansas editor-in-chief and I getting to know each other at various academic conferences. And that had always been a book that he liked, too. And he said, "May I reissue that?" And I talked to Kentucky, and they said, "Well, okay." And that's all it was. Now, I wrote a new introduction to it, but it's basically that same book with a new, updated introduction. And I got one bad review on that because the reviewer was thinking this was going to be an analysis by me of the first book. And I could see where maybe somebody might think that. But my intention was to let Kansas, since it wanted to, republish the book for a more modern audience.
Sure. So that's your favorite book. What was the hardest book to research and write? Not necessarily your least favorite.
Right.
What was the hardest?
Well, I think a book called Spy Watching, which came out in 2018. It's a tome, if there ever was one. It'll put you to sleep instantly. And it'll break your back even just picking it up from the bookshelf. But
You're a heck of a salesman, Lon.
I know. But
Don't quit your day job.
you can see why my books aren't selling that much. My wife is always after me, "Go out there and pitch that book," but I'm not really that interested in doing that.
Poor man's back can't handle it.
And some of the books have done pretty well on their own merits. But that book was hard because it was a kind of summation of all of my thoughts about how to control these secret agencies without stifling their initiative. And you can do that. You can have them do the things they're supposed to do well and help that and encourage that without letting them stray into domains such as spying on the very citizens they were created to protect. You don't want that. So it was a book about how that balance can be achieved and a long history of America's experience in trying to achieve that goal, at least since 1947. I didn't go back to the early period, which you have done, and maybe you can do that at some point. There are some people who've gone back to the era of the Founding Fathers and looked at intelligence. Yeah. But frankly, the U.S. didn't have much organizational intelligence. I almost said intelligence. I don't want to say that about the United States. We've always been an intelligent nation. But we didn't have very many organized intelligence organizations until post-World War II.
Right.
And so that's what I was mainly interested in.
Which is makes sense because New Deal, post-World War II, you have the growth of the organizational state apparatus.
Yeah, and Pearl Harbor was a huge wake-up call. Hey, we better protect ourselves. Not to mention the rising Soviet specter.
This is an aside, but there's been a few books written about sort of the elite, we'll call it, origins of the intelligence community in the United States. And by elite, I mean Ivy Leagues, the sort of upper crust, the WASP establishment, to employ a mildly insulting term. How much of that is true, and I'm thinking Cloak and Gown. There was a book, and then there was I think
Great
it was
book,
called
by the
the Old Boys. I think there was another book in the 80s, 90s about those elite. How much of that is true, and how much of that is sort of overblown?
Well, in fact, I think it is true. If you go back to 1947, when the CIA was created, and we began to modernize the few fragments of intelligence organizations we had from World War II, converting a communications outfit, for example, into the National Security Agency,
Right.
which went on to become our biggest intelligence agency. If you look at those organizations in their early beginnings, they were, in the old joke, male, pale, and Yale. And they were overwhelmingly from Princeton, Yale, and Harvard, with a few others thrown in, but not that many. But that's changed dramatically. There's been a kind of democratization of the intelligence community for its own good, I think. You take someone from the University of Georgia, there's a saying in New York City, in the financial community, that UGA business school grads work from Monday through Saturday. The Yale grads that they get work from Monday to Thursday and then head for East Hampton. So sometimes these public university students are really not only very bright, and for one reason or another didn't go to the Ivy League, well, often because they couldn't afford it.
A Hope Scholarship.
Yeah, exactly. But also extremely, not only talented, but extremely dedicated and hardworking. So they began to be very competitive in seeking these intelligence community jobs as time unfolded.
Well, what do you think was the impetus behind that democratization of the intelligence community, the CIA and the others?
I think it had to do with the fact that Bill Colby became director of Central Intelligence shortly after Allen Dulles. Allen Dulles had been of the old school,
Right.
favoring the Ivy League. Colby had actually gone to Princeton and Columbia, so he did have Ivy League credentials, but he was a very enlightened, knowledgeable person.
A traitor to his class.
Right. And so he said, wait a minute, we're missing a lot of talent here. Well, it's the same problem today. I mean, think of all the women out there in this country who would be talented intelligence officers, but the intelligence agencies have been slow in opening up those doors. Now, they are beginning to open, and some of our top analysts right now are women. And as you know, the director of national intelligence right now is a woman. So, but that's been another barrier that's been broken down. These things sometimes take time.
So back to your publications. You retired in 2019, but you've continued to research and write. Is that correct?
Yes, I feel like I'm still a professor, but I'm not meeting students, which I really miss. That was the best part of being a professor in many ways. But I, as you know, am very committed to writing. And so since I've been up here, I've written 3 books and a lot of articles. And, you know, I've done a lot of Zooming, teaching to classes around the country. So in some ways, it's my life hasn't changed that much. But do I ever miss Athens, Georgia? And the only reason I'm not down there is because my grandchildren are up here.
Right.
And so in the struggle between the joys of Athens and grandchildren went out is what happened.
Athens is a great town, but I don't know that it. I think my parents and in-laws would agree with you. Maybe one of these days I'll get to know that
Right.
same.
But I do
same
get to
feeling.
Athens periodically, and it's always a joy when I do.
Right. So when I was here last time, I asked you about who your favorite spy novelists were and everything like that. Have you ever thought about dabbling in fiction writing? I mean, you can go by John Loch.
Here's a chance for me to follow my wife's advice and promote a manuscript I've got. I've just finished a spy novel, actually.
No way.
And there's an old saying, one should never do anything for the first time. So I don't know how good this effort has been, but it's called Sleeper. It had a much more elaborate title, but my daughter said, one-word title, So we got it down to sleeper because, you know, a mole of a foreign nation like Russia, who's penetrated inside the American intelligence establishment, is known as a sleeper because it's a person who's committing treason against America, getting paid by a foreign power, and when the power wants to, it can awaken that agent to begin to do some serious damage inside. So that's the idea. My pseudonym is Eric Bentley.
All right.
Everyone's got to have a pseudonym in this field.
Absolutely.
So we'll see if it gets published. I'm just now beginning to look around for an agent, and I'm finding that the fiction domain is very difficult to break into. I have a neighbor down here who's in the publishing business, but on the financial side, but he knows a lot about it. And he says your odds of publishing that first novel are about 1 in 40,000. So this may be reading material for my own family, for all I know.
Well, I'm certainly looking forward to it. At least I'm going to have to, if it doesn't get published, at least I know the author, so I can find out how to get on. So the first John Le Carré, no. The first Loch Johnson book I ever read was Seven Sins of American Foreign Policy, which in a roundabout way is why I'm at the University of Georgia, even though you and I never took a class. I never took a class with you. I ended up going...
That book was fun to write.
I ended up going the historical route instead of the political science route. But that's what put University of Georgia on my radar initially.
Well, as you know from reading some of my work, I'm basically a historian too.
well, a political historian, a political scientist who can write is just a historian. That's my opinion.
I agree.
So tell me about, this came out in 2007, so the Iraq War and the War on Terror would have been very fresh in your mind, the public's mind. So what was your purpose behind writing that book at that time?
Initially, I had been, as you've mentioned, writing books on intelligence, and Season of Inquiry being the first. And I thought, well, what are the basic flaws in the world of intelligence? And then I thought about that old phrase, 7 sins. I think that's probably biblical. And I thought, what are the 7 sins of intelligence? And one of them was to give information to politicians and they misuse it for political purposes. One sin of intelligence. And then later on, after a few years of writing about intelligence, I thought, well, what about these sins of American foreign policy? What would they look like? So again, I like that catchy little phrase, 7 sins. And I tried to think of the 7 major weaknesses in American foreign policy. One of which was the fact that the American people are not well informed on that subject. So
we can probably think of a few others.
I thought of 6 others. So that was the origin of that, and it was fun to write. And I got an email, believe it or not, yesterday from a student in Georgia saying he had read that book and could he come over and talk to me. And I wrote back and said, yeah, come on up to Connecticut if you want, but I'm not living in Athens right now. So people are still reading that, and I think people realize that our foreign policy is flawed in some ways. I think it's very strong in other ways. So that was the motivation, to point out how we could strengthen our relations with other countries.
I think it was incredibly salient at the time. Robert and I were both in college during the Iraq War and the War on Terror, of just how salient those failures of American foreign policy were, especially in the Middle East. And it's been very interesting and eye-opening to see foreign policy, or at least intelligence successes, in Eastern Europe and Russia. And Robert and I were sort of joking in that we're not used to this experience of the intelligence service being so right about so many things all the time.
Right.
So that's a new experience for maybe you can write the 7 successes of American foreign policy.
One could. But we are human beings, and we are flawed, and we make mistakes, and we do some good things and some.
And intelligence is a human institution.
Yeah, exactly. So there are going to be ups and downs.
You mentioned earlier about your work with Dr. Bullock with runoff elections, and that book came out in 92, 93.
That's about right, yeah.
Which is interesting because one of the most important runoff elections in Georgia was 1992 between Paul Coverdell and Wyche Fowler. What did Dr. Bullock drag you kicking and screaming back to American politics, or how did that book come about?
Well, he didn't do that because I had maintained an interest in that field, and even though I was writing about intelligence and American foreign policy, I was teaching political science 101 to 350 students every single semester, which I loved. And I was teaching a course on the Congress and mainly on the presidency. So I was very much involved in that. And Chuck and I became great friends, and we ran the Atlanta Marathon together and trained for 12 months before that. You know, you train for 12 months out on the road for a marathon with someone, you get to know them pretty well. So we've had a long friendship. And we both thought the runoff was a very important yet misunderstood procedure. In fact, right now he and I are talking about doing an op-ed, or I guess some people call it a guest editorial these days, on the runoff, because if you go back and look at the 2016 election, one of the reasons that Trump did so well, and I just personally, I don't think he was that good a president, but he won that year, and the reason he did in part, I think, is because if you look at the presidential primaries, some of them had no runoffs whatsoever. In fact, there wasn't a single presidential primary that had a runoff that year. And you look at South Carolina, there were about 12 Republican candidates in that primary. And he managed to get about 20% of the vote, but the rest of the vote was so fragmented that he won that primary and all the delegates from South Carolina based on that small fraction of vote. And that seemed inappropriate to us. And if there had been a runoff, then Trump would have had to go into another runoff election, and probably Jeb Bush or Ted Cruz or somebody else who was more well-known would have defeated him at that point. And we would have ended up with a more experienced politician running for the presidency. So we think the runoff is quite important.
Well, I think we saw in Alaska and in Maine, where they now have the instant runoff or ranked choice voting, which has been used in the metropolitan areas of the United Kingdom for several years, several election cycles. You know, I guess probably most famously the mayor of London is elected that way. Up in Alaska, you know, Alaska is represented by a Democrat in Congress for the first time in 50 plus years, because of there were Republican voters who would vote for not Mark Begich, but one of the Begiches up there. Didn't want to cross over for Sarah Palin. So it's very interesting to see, and with the technology, that a lot of states could save a lot of money on the states that do conduct runoffs.
Yes,
with
and
implement instant runoffs.
I think Chuck Bullock and I think the runoff is superior to this other method of voting that you referred to in Alaska. Theoretically, that's an interesting method and has a lot to be said for it, but it is baffling in its complexity. And I'm not sure the American people really want an ultra-complex election procedure, because already, as you well know, there are election deniers out there. And if you make it even more complicated, I think it's going to be a little more difficult to sell the legitimacy of the outcome of the election. So the runoff is pretty straightforward, but I think it has the same effect.
Sure. So we're sitting almost 900,000 miles away from Athens. What was your favorite memory about your time working or teaching in Athens?
Well, I must say that being with students was my favorite time. I just found it inspiring to be with younger people and to help them think through what their strengths and weaknesses were and how to improve their standing, so that when they went out in life that they could be more successful. And I like the idea of helping them understand what the range of possibilities were in terms of careers. I liked helping them improve their writing. I thought that one of the big weaknesses of any university was the inability of students to orally present their ideas. So I made sure that in my classroom that everyone had a chance to give a presentation.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like anything else, golf or whatever. The more you do it, well, maybe not golf, because I was going to say the more
I've been doing that a long time, and I don't seem to get any better.
Same with me, so forget that example. But generally speaking, the more you do something, the better you get at it.
Right.
And so I want the students to have that opportunity. Because, most university classes, at least when I got started, were designed around students coming in and professors filling them up with information. Well, that was not the right model in my view. I thought the right model was a rich interaction of dialogue between the professor and the students having a chance to present their views, not only in discussions, but in some formal presentations. So all of that was thrilling to me. And of course, I love my writing. You put me behind my computer and let me write the next chapter, and I am thrilled. And let me not forget my colleagues. I'm Chuck Bullock, lifelong friend. Gary Birch, one could go on. I have many faculty friends down there that I miss dearly, and they so enriched my life while I was there. So it's that complex of all those things together.
Oh, I guess this is a good time to talk about the UGA Teaching Academy. So you're talking about teaching and sort of the evolution of classroom pedagogy, and I guess how students have changed over time. So what was the thought behind the UGA Teaching Academy, the pin which you're wearing on your lapel right now?
Well, we thought that teaching is extremely important. In fact, we argued, a number of us who would get together over coffee and some other liquid refreshments from time to time, that teaching wasn't taken sufficiently seriously at the university.
Taken seriously by administration?
By the administration. Yes, thanks for that clarification. Sure. And also by some professors who were very research-oriented, as we were actually.
Sure.
But we thought that the fundamental purpose of the university was to help students develop themselves, learn about the world, and get ready for life. And that meant the teaching process. And so we decided, let's formalize our interests in teaching. Let's have a teaching academy so that we can get together on a regular basis for dinners and other events and bring in younger faculty members to join this organization. And we soon began to have conferences, annual conferences up at Unicor, which is in the North Georgia mountains. And I think it was a great success. And I see they're having a reunion fairly soon, too, of all the people who have been senior teaching fellows and others associated with the Teaching Academy. Joe Brody over in agriculture was really one of the great leaders in this effort, and sort of the person who drew us forward over the years. We followed his leadership. But it was a collective effort, too. And I think it's really spurred interest in teaching around campus.
Now, how was the Teaching Academy different from, say, the Center for Teaching and Learning, the CTL that's over in the PJ Plaza?
Well, they were brothers, really, or siblings, if you like. They really worked together closely. The center was a more formal organization that had available film archives that you could use in your classroom, that helped put together this annual symposium on teaching that I referred to earlier. So it was sort of the hardcore institutional apparatus that the Teaching Academy relied on from an administrative point of view. So the Academy was more or less a collection of professors interested in teaching, whereas the center was the administrative part of that teaching effort. And we hovered around it for support.
Right. So SPIA.
SPIA, my favorite subject.
You came to the UGA in 1979. The last college to be created before SPIA and the College of Environmental Design, which was created around the same time.
After SPIA.
After SPIA. It was 1969, so there had not been a new college in a long time. And walk me through the process. When did you and others start plotting, we'll say?
plotting.
that there needed to be a new college, and that political science and these others needed to sort of break away, secede from the Franklin College of Arts and Sciences, and become its own entity.
Well, do you have about 8 hours? Because I can go.
Oddly enough, I do, actually.
You do? Well, SPIA is, as you can tell, dear to my heart. And back in let's see, let me get this right, 1997,
Okay.
I had been giving some lectures around the country. And some that stood out to me were Princeton and Harvard and Yale, because they had schools of public affairs. And I got to know those schools a bit. At Princeton, for example, is called the Woodrow Wilson School.
Right.
That name has been changed for reasons that go beyond what we're talking about here, but I think it should have been changed. But it was really a wonderful organization despite the name. And one can also say some good things about Woodrow Wilson when it comes to foreign policy, but basically he was a racist, and that's why they took his name away from that institution. I brought back to the University of Georgia the kernel of an idea. Why don't we have something like this? Now, why would one want to have something like this? Well, I thought the Department of Political Science, as good as it was, and I was proud to be a member of that department, was too narrowly focused. I thought if you had a School of Public Affairs, you could have an International Affairs department, a political science department focusing mainly on American government, and a public administration department. So I saw the opportunity here for a much richer handling of the whole field of politics. And I also thought that the political science department was becoming a little bit too esoteric, too interested in publishing another article in some obscure journal in order to get tenure and to move forward. An article that might have been interesting to maybe 3 or 4 other people in the country and maybe to the editor of that journal, but not to most citizens, not to most students, and not even to most fellow faculty members. And as a historian, you know how esoteric political science can become. So I thought, we're doing our students a disservice because they don't care about correlational analysis. They want to know about Sam Nunn. They want to know about U.S. defense policy and all of that. And that's what I was interested in, too. So I thought if we could break out and have a wider offering of courses, including courses of a distinctly practical nature, grooming people to become Senate aides and White House aides and members of the Congress and presidential candidates one day, that would be a great service, instead of simply training people to become professors of political science, which seemed to be the motivation for writing a lot of these articles. And by the way, those esoteric articles often spilled over into the classroom, and the classroom became a rather dry exercise in methodology, instead of talking about the wonderful, exciting world of politics. So those were the motivations that made me begin to think about this. And the next year, 1998, I went to Michael Adams, who was a fairly new president, and I talked to him about that. He said, well, that's not a bad idea. I'll tell you what, he said, you go out and get 50 signatures for me of all the top deans in this university and the department heads relevant to what you're talking about, and then we'll consider this. And I thought, really? But I really believed in this idea. So I began traipsing around campus, talking to all these people, which took 6 to 8 months or so. Got signatures of all 50 people that I went to after a lot of lobbying and discussion, and went back to Adams. I think he was a little bit surprised that I actually followed through on this. And he said, okay, well, why don't you form a committee in the political science department and draft a proposal, then I'll consider it. So I did that and drafted a proposal, formed a committee of about 10 people who I thought would be interested. And we met periodically, we drafted a proposal. This took another several months. So by now we're probably into 1999. These things move slowly. because they're coalition building efforts. You can't do these things on your own. You've got to have people behind you. We got that together and took it back to Adams. He liked it. He then, and this was an important turning point, I think, took it to his speechwriter, and it ended up in being State of the University address, a paragraph or so, which gave it some high visibility. But that was really only the beginning, because then what I had to do was to go to the Franklin College Senate to sell the idea. Then I had to go to the University Council and sell the idea. And the curriculum committee for Franklin College. I mean, you wouldn't believe how many different gatekeepers there were.
Oh, I think I'd believe it.
I dutifully went to all of them, and I enlisted the help of the department head, Thomas Loth, who liked the idea too, and he helped me. Basically, the two of us went around talking to people about this. And then early on, I'm not going to go on forever about this, but just to give you a final sense, the faculty senate in Franklin College voted it down by 2 votes. And I was, of course, crushed, but disappointed, but not willing to give up. And I tinkered around with some of the ideas that they had, some reservations they had. And I went back to them 6 months later, and it passed, thanks to a lot of lobbying that went on in between. I'm talking about taking people down to Jittery Joe's for coffee and talking to them and pleading with them. So, but then we had to go to the faculty, to the University Council, or the Franklin College faculty, which had a big meeting, and they had a vote there, and that only won by about 5 or 6 votes of 100 people or so there. So you can see there was some opposition. The basic opposition was, why do you want to rip political science out of the Franklin College, which is a liberal art college? We need the political science department there. And I told people, look, we're not going down to Macon. We're going to be staying here. We'll be here. Your students can still take these classes. But here's why we want a School of Public Affairs. And my own department, by the way, was comprised, as I mentioned earlier, of 24 people. We had a vote there early on. The vote was 23-1 in favor. So within my own nucleus of organization, I had a pretty good support among fellow political scientists. But we went forward, and we finally got it passed at the University Council after a lot of debate. And by early 2001, we had this major University Council meeting and a victory. And then it went to the regents, yet another gatekeeper. Well, the next step really, after passage by the University Council, was to go back to Adams. And of course, he'd been on board earlier on, so he signed it. Then it went to the regents, and we didn't know what the regents would do about this, but they passed it overwhelmingly. So in April of 2001, the regents approved it, and that made SPIA official. That was fairly long-winded, but as you can see,
No. So just to underline it, the crux of the opposition boiled down to, it's always been this way, so it should always remain this way?
Yes, and that was not the view, as you can see from that vote I mentioned, 23-1, the political science department. That was not the view of the political science department, but the view of some entities in the Franklin College, which I'll remind you was the Liberal Arts College, remains the Liberal Arts College, named after Benjamin Franklin.
Sure.
And they thought, as I mentioned, how can you have a liberal arts college without a political science department? But you know, I didn't buy that argument. I mean, we were still going to be there. We were very tightly interwoven with the Franklin College anyway. We continued to teach our same courses. We just had a new standalone framework with our own dean and an opportunity to spread out. And by the way, I mentioned the faculty of 24 people. Within a decade, we had a faculty of 3 times that number. I knew it was going to grow because it was an important idea, and I knew it would attract fundraisers from outside and the opportunity to hire new faculty members. So I think it's been a great success, and the empirical evidence of that, I think, or at least one indication is, it's now rated number 3 in U.S. News and World Report among public affairs schools, with Syracuse in number 1, for good reason. They've got a very great program up there in which they bring in the sociology department and the econ department. It's a huge undertaking. I think maybe too big, actually.
I see.
And then the Harvard Kennedy School is the second one. And of course, they've got huge endowment and they can afford to have a fabulous program. But to become number 3 within, what is it now, 21 years?
20 years.
I think it's a pretty good achievement.
How did, we've sort of outlined how administratively it changed, but was there a change in culture from SPIA, or excuse me, from Franklin College to what is now SPIA, or a difference in sort of outlook from liberal arts?
Well, in a way, you know, I think since those 24 members, public administration, political science, international affairs, political theory, American government, we're all in the same building, Baldwin Hall. We saw each other every day, and there's a close internet relationship. My argument at the time, and this is a failure, unfortunately, so far, was that we needed a building for SPIA so we could remain united in that sense and have the synergism that comes with being in the same building. Now, political science, American government, under SPIA is in still Baldwin Hall along with public administration, but international affairs is over in Candler Hall.
Right.
And there are a couple of other entities.
I think the dean's office is in Candler.
Yeah,
I think Matt's office is
so
in Candler.
that's unfortunate, but I must say we've compensated for that by having regular faculty meetings in which we all come together, serious business meetings, but also social events, winter holiday party, for example, and other events like that. But you know, one day, I keep hoping, and I think this will happen one day, some rich Georgian, probably a former UGA person who has done well in New York or some other financial place, will say, here I am, put my name on that building, and I'm going to pay for that building. And I've already got the location for it. You know, you go across East Campus Road, and there's a railroad line there. Go across the railroad line, and there's a huge parking lot. That's the location for the SPIA building, and it's going to happen one of these days.
Well, maybe it'll be your name up on the podium.
No, I
Who
doubt
knows?
that. I doubt that. It'll be the name of the donor. And if I could raise $1 billion or even 20 million between now and a couple of years from now, I will give it to them, and then they will put my name on it. But since that's unlikely to happen, we're going to have to rely on someone else.
So you mentioned Gary Birch earlier. CITS, the Center for International Trade and Security, that became an entity in the 1980s,
Right.
but is now under the aegis of SPIA. How were those sort of independent units like CITS,
Right.
Globus,
Right.
how were those incorporated into SPIA?
Well, even pre-SPIA, remember SPIA started officially in 2001, we had the political science department, as we've discussed, but we had some subsidiary units as well. And you've mentioned the two main ones. First, Globus, which was an organization to help students study abroad and still a very vibrant organization. And then Gary Birch created the Center for International Trade and Security, which I thought was a wonderful initiative. And he did that hand in hand with Ambassador Martin Hillenbrand, who was an important figure in the State Department who joined our faculty. So he was able to attract a lot of financial support, and Gary had the organizational acumen and the substantive knowledge to make that place really a serious intellectual operation. And when we created SPIA in 2001, we took the political science department and divided it into 3, international affairs, public administration, political science. But then we also brought in CITS, the Gary Birch organization, and Globus as part of it. And I'm sure in the future there'll be other organizations like that that are part of SPIA. I thought at the time, and here's a battle I did lose, that the Institute of Government, which is part of the University of Georgia, would have been a natural ally. But for complicated reasons, basically having to do with them wanting to have their own turf and maybe not wanting to be subsumed under a new organization, they remained aloof from the idea. But I think one day that would make some sense. And one of the reasons Syracuse is #1 is they have brought in entities like that, and they build a much more robust organization than we currently have at SPIA.
So, was the first dean of SPIA, was that an external hire or was that a promotion from within?
Well, initially we did a national search, and we found a fellow, I think he was at the University of Indiana at the time, as I recall, and he came in and interviewed and really just so impressed us. Mm-hmm. He was highly articulate and friendly and so on. So we had some other candidates, and Tom Loch, the person I mentioned earlier, who was the department head for political science and an ally of mine in developing SPIA, was a candidate, and a very good one too. So it was really between those two. But this, I think there was a general feeling among some people in the political science department that maybe it'd be good to bring someone new in and get a new perspective on things, particularly since he had been at a School of Public Affairs out in Indiana and had some experience. But it turned out that he began to make all these demands on us that were sort of uncharacteristic of what we thought he was, and were really wildly beyond anything we could accommodate, such as, a huge travel budget for him and his wife, and other things that were really beyond the pale. So we backed away from him, and Tom Loch was there and prepared and had been department head for an eternity, so he had that experience and he was well liked. So he became the first dean and did a fabulous job.
So moving back to teaching, if anybody Googles your name, Loch Johnson, University of Georgia, they'll probably find something called the Loch Johnson Society.
Oh, yeah.
What is that all about?
Well, that's the question I asked a couple of years ago too, because I retired in 2019 and came up here, and I got an email telling me about the Loch Johnson Society. And I think what happened there is I'd created the John Adams Society, because I kind of like John Quincy Adams. I liked his father for that matter, but this is the John Quincy Adams Society. And what I liked about him, this is part of the International Affairs Department, was his foreign policy. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And his discerning ability to stay away from some things that were a quagmire. And I thought he had a very wonderful judgment about when America should get involved overseas and when we shouldn't. So I patterned the society after him. It was basically a discussion society.
Okay.
And we'd have discussion meetings with students and faculty members from time to time. And then I left, and next thing I know, the students in that organization said, "Why are we calling this the John Quincy Adams Society? We're going to call this the Loch Johnson Society." Of course, needless to say, I was deeply flattered by that and honored. And I don't know how long it'll last. Maybe that core of students who knew me when I was still there will go on, and people in a year or two will say, "The Who Society?" It'll become the Donald J. Trump Society, for all I know. Well, we'll see.
Well, we'll have to keep our eye on that. So, teaching, research, but you also took an interest in the physical spaces on campus. You mentioned that your great desire to have a SPIA building, which hasn't come to fruition, but you were involved in things like Founders Memorial Garden, right, the UGA Service Memorial. Mm-hmm. Tell me, of all the things you had going on, what compelled you to take on more work, mm-hmm, and try to bring these memorials, mm-hmm, and physical spaces into reality?
Well, I used to meet for coffee occasionally with Tom Dyer, and Ash, I don't know if you ever knew him or not.
Tom was, I had his last class. Right. He taught at Institute of Higher Education. It was History of Higher Education.
Oh, good.
And he actually is the one who introduced my wife and I to the Emmanuel Episcopal Church.
Oh, yeah.
So he was very good to me.
Well, I'm glad that
during
Tom
my
knew
time.
Each other.
I got to know him, a few years, at least 2 good years, before he got really sick, and passed away.
Well, he and I
before his time.
We're friends. We'd meet occasionally, and I remember walking across campus, North Campus, with him one time, and I said, we need a greater sense of tradition here. And I'd just come back from Harvard and Yale. In fact, that trip, sure, I mentioned earlier. And I remember John Harvard, a statue of John Harvard in the center of Harvard, and how you'd go by and you'd look at that and you'd realize Harvard's been around a long time. And then I remember the statue of Nathan Hale. I regret that I have but one life to give to my country, his famous comment before he was hanged by the British as a spy. And Yale, where I taught for as a fellow for a semester, wonderful experience, had a lot of examples of that kind of tradition. And I thought, we don't have enough of that at Georgia. And I also noticed when I was there, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and many other places had memorials to those who had died in wars. And I thought, this is really important, because here are students who gave the ultimate sacrifice to defend democracy, and they're being honored in this way. And I knew in Memorial Hall that we had a small plaque before World War II, but nobody ever went in there.
Right.
Nobody knew about it. So one of the things I brought back with me after that tour that I mentioned to you earlier was not only the SPIA idea, but the idea for enriching the historical tradition of the University of Georgia. And I thought a war memorial might be a good place to begin. I preferred calling it a service memorial because I began to believe that, a number of people have passed away serving the United States or the state of Georgia in public service capacities, either in law enforcement, or I knew of a couple of journalists who had gone to Georgia and died in combat overseas covering that kind of public service of their own. So I wanted to have a service memorial, and I began to talk to people about that, and I must say I was somewhat Machiavellian about this, even though I don't like Machiavelli, because of his values are fame, fortune, and money, and those are not my main interests. But anyway, he was right in the sense you have to do some strategizing from time to time. So I engineered my way into the Facilities Committee of the University Council and into the chairmanship of that committee. That gave me the opportunity to begin to have an official position for creating a service memorial. And so I did that and sold it to the committee, then we sold it to the University Council, and we began to go forward. But then came the problem, two problems really. One, raising the money. But after beating the bushes for a few months, I was able to find people who were willing to pay for that. And there's a plaque down there where the memorial is that lists their name, 3 well-to-do UGA alum who provided money to it. The other problem was what to do with the Civil War, because I got telephone calls and visits from people on both sides of this. You want to honor people who had slaves? What's wrong with you? And others who said, you must honor those who fought in the Civil War because they were giving their last devotion to service for a belief that they had, democracy in the South. And so I saw merits on both examples, and it occurred to me at the time that I had been very much against the war in Vietnam, but I deeply admired and had written, published articles on the veterans who fought in that war, one of my other interests. And so I thought, it's not the merits of any war that we're talking about here. None of us really particularly like war, to say the least. But rather the notion of young people being called upon, serving, and then unfortunately dying in that service. So that's why I wanted to include those who had fallen in the Civil War as well. I didn't know if any of them had slaves or belonged to families that did. That wasn't the point. The point was these young men, no women at the University of Georgia at that time, came forward when asked to and gave their lives. So we another question I had was, how are we going to have a wall? Because we had the famous Vietnam Memorial wall in Washington, which is the most visited site in that city, by the way, by tourists. And I've been there many times and have the names of friends who are engraved on that wall, as do many other people. But I thought, what really impressed me when I went to the Smithsonian to see a historical exhibit on the Vietnam War was what they called a Book of Remembrance. And you could scroll through there and see the names of all the Americans who had fought in Vietnam and a little bit about them. And I thought, that's what I want. I want a book of remembrance, because walls are expensive and there are lots of mistakes that are made, and unfortunately we continue to have wars, so you've got to add to them. With a book of remembrance, you could just go into Tate Center right near where the outdoor memorial is and look at the people and find out more about those who served. So that's what we did. And I think it's one of the most visited places on campus. And I used to love to walk through there. And as you know, once a year on Memorial Day, that place is covered with small American flags to honor those veterans who have fallen.
Were you, since you were on facilities committee, were you the one, or did your committee determine that location?
Yes.
Which is really
Yes.
I think it is an appropriate location, because if you're walking down from LeConte or Park Hall, it's the ROTC building, Military Science Building's right there.
And it's in the center of campus as well.
And, you talk about most visited, well, that's right by the Student Learning Center, the Miller Learning Center, which is the busiest academic building on campus.
Now when you plan something like SPIA or this memorial, you have successes and failures. And my failure in that facility had to do with a water part of the architecture. I wanted to have a pond there, a water, reflecting water area. But the architecture on campus and some others said to me, that would be so expensive and so difficult to maintain that we recommend against it. So I was finally won over to that point of view, I suppose because I realized I was going to lose on that anyway. But it would have been nice to have a reflecting pool there as well, and maybe one day there will be. But right now, I think it's quite lovely the way it is.
I guess the water would have been where that green space is, opposite the large stones.
Yeah.
So the service garden, or the service memorial, and there is now where I used to play catch after classes on Friday, a statue of Abraham Baldwin.
That's right.
So I had to move a few feet over thanks to Loch Johnson over here.
I'm sorry to interrupt your Frisbee playing space. Well, again, that sprang from the idea of seeing Nathan Hale and John Harvard, and my talks with Tom Dyer about how we ought to have some reflection of that ourselves on campus. So, again, as the chairman of the facilities committee, I was in a position to propose that and put it forward. And we had a spirited meeting on the question, and there was some opposition. In fact, one of my friends argued against it. He said, how can you justify paying for a statue when janitors on this campus are making $20,000 a year? And I had heard that argument before, and I was very sympathetic to it. And I had argued at the University Council on many occasions for raising the salaries of workers on campus. But I told him, and I think I was right about this, that there are some donors out there who, unfortunately, don't really care about janitors' pay. But what they would like to do is to have a statue of Abraham Baldwin. And if they're out there and they want to pay for a statue like that, and that will add to the tradition and glory of the University of Georgia to honor its founder, then we should do it. And the vote in the University Council was overwhelming in favor of having that statue. The next question was who's going to be the sculptor, and it turned out that, and I had nothing to do with this, but the alumni foundation really liked this idea. They heard about it and they said, we want to fund this. We really love this idea. And they found a sculptor and her husband, two man and woman sculptors working together, to create this statue of Abraham Baldwin. It's 1.5 lifetime scale. And it turned out the woman was a good friend of mine. I had nothing to do with her hiring, but she had been the wife of Jack Watson, and I had led his campaign for governor, at least in that part of Georgia. So I knew her well, and I knew that she would do a great job. In fact, her grandfather, I think it was, had been dean of the UGA Law School. So there was a real connection there. And I think they came up with a wonderful statue. And one of the things I love about it when the weather gets cold, as it's beginning to do now in Georgia, someone will inevitably bring a scarf over and put it around dear old Abraham Baldwin. Now, last year, I got a rather nasty email from someone saying, how could you have led the movement to create a statue of a racist who owned slaves? And, you know, it gets into the whole question of what about Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and other people of that era who had slaves? And I think that you just have to look at what some of the other things that these people did. I don't know anything about Abraham Baldwin's relationship to slavery. I've never studied that. But I did know that he was a very important signator of the U.S. Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, a supporter of the Declaration of Independence. So he played a major role at the nominating convention in 1787 in Philadelphia, and had done a lot of other good things. And he was the one who really led the founding of the University of Georgia. So it struck me as someone who we should honor for that part of his life, setting aside the other part, which was unfortunately a blemish on our history and will always be.
Right. What I assume, you know, the stain of slavery, you know, affected northern states the same as, especially if you're talking John Harvard and
Yes.
you know, Rhode Island,
Yeah.
New Jersey, which was really the slaveholding state of the North well into the 19th century. So
Incidentally, Ash, going back to that service memorial, when I was up at Harvard, I realized that they had honored Nazis who had attended Harvard University and gone back to Germany. And I must say, I was unwilling to go that far.
Well, that is certainly a decision that was made.
No, I don't know if any Germans had come to UGA and gone back and become Nazis or not, but I wouldn't have wanted to see them on the honor roll.
Well, this is a rough transition, but we're going to make it. You mentioned Jack Watson and campaign. Were you involved in? I think you'd worked for Jack Watson and you had been an advisor earlier. You advised maybe Pierre Howard at some point, or helped his campaigns for lieutenant governor.
Well, you know, both my wife Lena and I have veins and arteries that flow with politics. We love politics. And we'd always been activists no matter where we went. And when we came down to Athens, we knew Jack Watson, not well, by the way, and I actually had not worked for him. I'd worked directly for Jimmy Carter for a period of time. But I knew of Jack Watson, and he knew of me, and he had a campaign organizational meeting and asked me to come to Atlanta, and I immediately found him a really magnetic personality and someone extremely appealing. And I thought he had a shot at it, even though the odds would be long, becoming governor of Georgia when he hadn't really been in Georgia that much. But I thought it was worth a try. And I was glad to help someone in the Carter administration who had those ambitions and had the qualifications. Mm-hmm. So I became his coordinator for the area out where the University of Georgia is. And by the way, Clark County is one of the, I think, 2 or 3 counties that he ended up winning. So I'm proud of that, although you don't win the governorship by winning 3 in 3 counties. But it was an exhilarating period, and you know, what's that hamburger place downtown now? I can't remember. But we took over the basement of that place and turned it into a Jack Watson campaign headquarters. We had banners and everything, and he came out and spoke. And Lena and I, my wife and I, did that for a number of people. We got involved in Pierre Howard's lieutenant gubernatorial race, which he won, then later his gubernatorial race, which he withdrew from for complicated reasons. We worked very closely to help Wyche Fowler in his first Senate election and became very close friends with him. And of course, he ended up serving on the House and the Senate Intelligence Committee. So I'd already known him on the House Committee, and followed his career when he was on the Senate side. And we remain very good friends today. So he's quite a talented individual. And then, you know, we found ourselves, once we had gotten a reputation for being the true political people in town, we became organizers for Democratic presidential candidates. I remember when Al Gore came to town one time, and I've never seen an advance party like his. They swept into town, and it was the most professional, exciting moment I've been in terms of politics. I mean, they had everything so well organized with balloons and streamers and everything. And I thought, if this guy can do this, he can probably lead the country too pretty well. Didn't work out that way, but that was exciting. Jerry Brown came to town. I got to introduce him, and a very impressive guy. He wanted to talk to me about political theory and knew it very well.
Oh, yeah.
So there's a lot to be said for being involved in politics. I think I still hold the record for Clark County for a number of yard signs that have been placed around the city.
Well, in that same vein, you were also involved in a lot of issues related to an issue near and dear to my heart, which is public education in Athens and the Clark County School District. So much of the infrastructure in Clark County is paid for by the educational special purpose local option sales tax. Now, you were involved in that campaign and helping to, organize what became the eventual construction of Cedar Shoals High School.
Right.
That was your side of town, was it not?
Yes. Well,
sort of southeast Athens.
My interest in public education in Athens was deep, like yours, in part because I had a daughter who went through that system. And by the way, it was valedictorian at Cedar Shoals High School.
Hear, hear.
So we liked the public schools. We thought they worked, and they could be improved, obviously, but they worked. And so we were dedicated as parents as she worked her way through the system. But even after she left, and after she left, I was approached by the superintendent of the school board, Ballantine was his name, John Ballantine, and he asked me if I would be interested in leading the effort to pass a 1-cent sales tax that would fund the building of a new high school over in Cedar Shoals, the east side of town, as well as repairs of existing schools throughout the school district. And I said, sure, I'll do my best. So we started this organization called SOS, Save Our Schools. Mm-hmm. And we, blitzed Clark County with advertisements and yard signs. And I spent a good deal of my time appearing on radio programs. Barbara Dooley was very helpful by inviting me several times to appear on her talk show to talk about this. The basketball coach at the time, a fellow who came to us from Kentucky, I can't think of his name. Tubby Smith. Tubby Smith. His wife was very instrumental in helping pay for yard signs. So there was opposition. People don't like to see increases in their taxes, but it was only a 1 cent sales tax increase. And
paid for a lot by those game day crowds.
Yes, exactly. That was one of the appealing things about it. So I think that this was the first county in the state of Georgia, and maybe only one of 3, as I recall, who passed this initiative. And I think it led to the building of a beautiful Cedar Shoals High School and all kinds of renovations around the district.
Now, where was the previous high school?
It was right in the same area, but slightly below where the new one was built. And they kept the old one. They sort of joined the two together. But the old one, where my daughter was a student, was in terrible conditions. The rains would come and the roofs would leak, and it was just terrible.
That's the current issue with Clark Middle School over behind the library, the public library.
Right.
But I think that's going to get sorted out sooner rather than later.
Yeah,
but as long as they get it sorted out before my daughter moves out of Chase Street.
Burtis Downs and Michael Stipe were people who helped.
Burtis is a good friend. He was actually at our last big Russell Library event. We had a dinner with Greg Bluestein after an event.
He's a friend of mine, and Michael Stipe wrote me a check personally for $3,000 to help this effort. So a lot of people throughout the community rallied behind that. Mm-hmm. I think we spent about $20,000 trying to advance this idea. And you've got to do that. You can't win these things by not getting out there and lobbying for them.
So I was reading through, doing my research, as I do, and something called CCATS.
Oh, yeah.
Southeast Athens Community Action Team. What the heck is a CCAT?
CCAT. Well, that's an organization to try and advance the prospects for East Athens, because sometimes East Athens was forgotten. You know, West Athens is really
Robert nods vigorously over here.
So initially, I was president of Cedar Creek, which is the oldest subdivision in Athens. And I did
Julius Bishop's old farmland. His chicken farm.
Yeah. So later on, we extended the idea of having Cedar Creek as an organization to include all of Southeast Athens, or Eastern Athens. And the Cedar Creek effort, I think, was very successful. I created a block captain system, so every block in Cedar Creek had a captain who would help us get the word out for civic events and social events. So it's just trying to organize people so that we could have some influence in building up our part of Athens. And then with CCATS, it was actually a little less successful effort, but it had some useful activities it was involved in. One quick example, there was one business on Gaines School Road, which is a main thoroughfare of East Athens, that put up an enormous and extremely ugly sign, and we managed to get that sign taken down. Just little things like that to help improve the beauty of our side of town.
It's never a small feat to defeat the billboard or sign lobby in the state of Georgia. So, very quick story. Why is there a relay race named after Loch Johnson in the city of Athens?
Well, this goes back to Pierre Howard. Pierre and I, he would not call himself Pierre, obviously, even though he was fluent in French and had a French background by heritage. But that wouldn't play well in Georgia, so it was Pierre Howard, and I became close friends because of my involvement in helping his two campaigns. And I used to run the 400-meter hurdles in college and was a big track fan. And I went over one day to work out at the Cedar Shoals, the old Cedar Shoals High School track, and it was appalling. The track was the worst one I'd ever seen in my life.
Old cinder track?
Yeah, old cinder track.
I had one of those in high school, and it was appalling as well.
I still have some cinders where I fell once.
There's an entire generation or two that does.
That's right. So I went to Pierre because he was lieutenant governor, and I said, Pierre, help us with this track, please. And he put in a rider, I suppose, or an earmark, into a bill. I didn't think he was going to really follow through. I was sort of just venting, but he did. And the next thing I knew, we had a rather large sum of money for a new Cedar Shoals track. And it was a beautiful track. Didn't quite match the University of Georgia track, but it came very close. And it was better than any other track in northeastern Georgia at the high school level. And the coaching staff over there was, I think, so grateful for having this new track. And by the way, the Cedar Shoals track team was somewhat mediocre at the time. After that track was built, they began winning state championships. It reminds me a little bit about the natatorium at the UGA. We had a fairly mediocre men and women swimming team. After we built that, we started winning the national championship. So there's something about having wonderful facilities.
If you build it, they will come.
If you build it, they will come. So the coaching staff at Cedar Shoals High School was so grateful for the track that, to my amazement, they named an annual track event after me, which is very nice of them.
So what I always think about, and this is something that I deal with and Robert deals with, and anybody in academia, and to a degree, everybody in professional life, we've talked about teaching, research, service, community service. How, and then for you, government service as well, and visiting, teaching. How were you able to balance work and life? Did you ever find that challenging?
Yes, of course, because I was involved in a lot of different things, and it does take good time management. But we're only here for a short period of time, and I think it's important to try and help the organization that you work with, the University of Georgia in my case, the community you live in, and any other association you might have. And so you've got to divvy up your time. Mm-hmm. Most important in a pie chart for me was family. And if I may say so, I think I was a good dad. I spent a lot of time with, I only had one child, Kristen is her name. And I can remember going over to pick her up at First Presbyterian Nursery School. Yeah. And we'd walk along the university campus, well, a wall downtown in Athens, and through the university campus. And we'd do that every afternoon. And it's that kind of thing that I felt was extremely important and spent time doing. But we loved politics, and so we wanted to help good political candidates. We loved, adored, cherished the University of Georgia. We fell in love with that place. And so we wanted to help it grow, and we wanted it to have, as Tom Dyer and I agreed, a richer traditional presentation of its history. I wanted to have a political science department that was more than just an esoteric research organization that prepared students to be diplomats and politicians and all these other things. There were a lot of things that I thought were important, and so I tried to pursue them and tried to balance it all, with some failures here and there and a few successes occasionally.
Well, how have you found the transition from the Northeast Georgia Piedmont to the Northwest Hills of Connecticut?
Well, once you've lived in Athens for 40 years, you have deep roots and lots of friends and dear memories of students who I continue to stay in touch with. A lot of my students are in New York City and elsewhere, and we stay in touch. So you don't forget about that experience, and in some ways you long to continue it, and you try to keep up your connections. And I go back to Athens with my wife periodically. But at the same time, as I've alluded to earlier, nothing is more important to me than family. And my daughter moved up here, first in New York and then here where she has her own business. Let's put in a plug here. Take a look at Fawn Shop on the internet. Fawn Shop, children's clothing store. So she does that, and she has 2 kids. I have, therefore, 2 grandchildren, and I see them several times a week, which if I lived in Athens, I'd see them maybe once or twice a year. So it's been good, but it's been bittersweet to have left behind all those friends and all those memories in Athens. Now, a lot of people come up here. I've had many friends, Gary Birch among them, for example, who've been up here to visit. And I'm so thrilled to have the 2 of you here to visit as well. So we find people from Athens wandering through here. In fact, one of my students, Brian Quiniff, who works in New York City, has a place here nearby in Sharon, the next village over. So I see him periodically and his brand new little baby. So we're keeping up connections as best we can, but it's a bittersweet feeling nonetheless.
Sure, yeah. To every time there is a season, that's.
I'll tell you where I'm glued, though. I'm glued to this TV set for every Bulldog game that comes along.
Well, I'm glad they played a little bit better. You could see the struggles in the first half against Auburn. They're still there. I don't like how empty the middle of the field is on some of those running plays. The safeties over the top are getting a little stressful, but the second half was much better. And,
well, I'm chewing my fingernails already because I can see Florida coming up, and from what I hear, Tennessee's pretty good. So.
This may come back and bite us since we're on the historical record, but I think I'm much more concerned with Tennessee than I am Florida. Hendon Hooker is a great quarterback, and I think Josh Heupel, the coach of Tennessee, I think Tennessee has found their coach after 10 or 12 years of false starts. I think they've found a coach that can bring them, which is good for the SEC East.
I had to laugh about the last game though, because we've got these magnificent running backs as we've always had at Georgia,
right? And
they're pounding away and making some good yardage, and they're getting pounded back and bruises and everything. And then about halfway through the game, the Red Sea parts, and our quarterback races untouched for a touchdown.
Yeah.
And I bet those running backs were thinking, hey, now wait a minute, this is unfair.
Well, as a former lineman, I have to say that sometimes that just happens.
Yeah.
through no fault of our own.
As a former running back, I've always been very indebted to you strong guys up front.
Well, you just have to throw yourself in front of a middle linebacker every now and then. But that's been 20 years ago, and I'm glad I don't have to do it anymore. But they sure have been fun to watch, and that is a good thing about technology and cable and that you can be up here in Connecticut and be able to watch University of Georgia.
By the way, one of my dearest relationships in Athens was and continues to be with Jerry Moorhead. And I knew him when he was about as low on the totem pole as I was. We were both probably associate professors, and he was head of the honors program, and I was getting SPIA started. We both were joined together with our interest in the Foundation Fellows and the honors program. And I've watched him go up the hierarchy, and we remained friends the whole way. And he and I stay in close touch. And when I was down there, I counted this up just for fun the other day. We watched 24 Super Bowls together consecutively at my house.
Well, what you didn't say is when you were down there, it was to get the UGA Presidential Medal.
Oh, yeah.
So that was a...
Maybe that's why I got it, because he came to see Super Bowl at my house.
Well, I think you're being a little modest, because that's not how the medal selection process works. But certainly well deserved.
Thank you.
And well earned as well. Loch, anything else you'd like to record for posterity? I'm sure we've left out an entire interview's worth or more.
Well, the only thing I would say is that it's been so gratifying to see the University of Georgia come from its good but still modest stature back in 1970s to now on the U.S. News and World Report list of top public universities. And to combine that with football national championship and all the other things that are done so well at UGA is just so gratifying to me. And I'm one of the leading propagandizers, if I could put it that way, of the University of Georgia up here. And I tell people about how they can get a very wonderful education there for a lot less money than they're going to spend at many other places. And you go to UGA and you want to go on to medical school or law school or wherever, the record shows you've got a very good chance of succeeding with those aspirations.
There's a lot of out-of-state students down at UGA. It's not just 13th grade for the kids in Metro Atlanta anymore.
That's right.
So, well, UGA has Loch the Evangelist up here in the Northeast.
Evangelist, that's the word I was thinking.
Doing spreading the good news.
No.
Well, Loch, thank you so much.
Thank you too.
Once again for everything. We really enjoyed it, and
I hope you come
we all
back.
learned. We'll always find a reason, Loch. But no, this has been fantastic, and thank you again so much.
Thank you.